Hello, my name is Thomas. Welcome to British Culture. Albion Never Dies. This episode is all about the British Empire in Cyprus. Many people have asked me to cover aspects of the British Empire or just to do an episode on the British Empire. And I always like to do requests if I can. This is one which I find a bit of a challenge, how to approach it. It's a big topic, I suppose. It's a bit like eating an elephant. You do it one bite at a time. The only question is, of course, which end to start from. So I thought I'd start from Cyprus. Of course, as I've mentioned a few times on this podcast, I spent 7 years living on the island of Cyprus in what is now the Turkish side. And so I do have a bit of an insight into the empire in Cyprus. In fact, when I was living out there, I knew people who were part of the British Empire in a very real and meaningful sense. And of course, later on at university, I would study aspects of the British Empire. I wouldn't say I studied it. I wasn't doing history. I did peace studies. So often looking at modern day conflicts, we had to look at the history of places. And so that naturally fed into what is now a pretty standard discussion in the UK. Was the British Empire a good or a bad thing? That's not something I really want to get into, partly because I just find it incredibly reductionist. Was it good these 500 years? Was it? Where are you even looking at? Are you looking at the British Empire, say, in Australia and New Zealand? Even those two cases are radically different. Are you looking at the British Empire in Africa? Totally different history. And of course, they mainly focus on the 19th century. Are you looking at, say, Asia? In which case, are you looking at Hong Kong or India, which again, radically different? Europe, well, I guess there's Gibraltar and Cyprus, but there's also the British Empire's influence on the creation of modern-day Greece. Of course, even South America, not a main focus of the British Empire, unless we're really talking about the Caribbean, but even on the main kind of continental plate of South America, you've got pockets of Cornish-speaking people and Welsh-speaking people even today. North America, goodness knows whatever happened to them. So I'd say the idea of was the British Empire a good or a bad thing? When you're talking on such scale, I find it reductionist. I also find it quite absurd. Was the Roman Empire a good thing? What have the Romans ever done for us? As Monty Python said, the Greek Empire, or, in China, the Qing dynasty or the Ming dynasty, were they a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, I think this is the kind of thing that 1066 and all that did a rather good pastiche of, and then, King John became king, and that was a bad thing. It seems rather silly. But aside from it being reductionist and aside from it being absurd, most of all, I just find it incredibly dull. So, if you're looking at was it a good or a bad thing, there are many articles and many debates that go on. I just find it, quite honestly, too dull for words. What I do find interesting, of course, is myself and my own experiences growing up in Cyprus. So I was a teenager when I went out there. I was 16. And there were people who were in their 80s and 90s. One lady I can remember, she had gone out to Africa. She's an English lady. She'd gone out to Africa with her husband with 100 black bearers to convert people there to Christianity. They were a missionary couple. And that is an adventurous thing, especially in those days. There was no Skype, there was no WhatsApp, there was no internet. Newspapers, if they arrived, could be 6 months to a year out of date. They were going to the back of beyond, and of course modern medicine didn't necessarily stretch to everywhere that they went. It was a very, very isolated experience, but one in which, well, you had to live under the local sun, you had to eat the local food, you had to drink the local drink, you had to learn the local language. It was a very, very different experience. Of course, there's people today going out to do good work for charity, and when I went to university, there's a chap who always talked about his time in Africa and his amazing time in Africa and how much it changed his worldview, and I don't doubt it did. He was a young man, but he had spent a few weeks out there and had regular calls home, and of course they had a TV, and it was a very different thing from how it was in previous times. So talking to those people gave me a very different perspective. Of course, at university, things tend to be quite left-wing, and that's commented upon much today about these universities are incredibly left-wing. And I tend to think, well, yes, and most banks and CEOs and financial institutions tend to be quite right-wing, I imagine. Everyone falls into their crowd. But as I say, at university, I came across these as a mature student, saying, "Oh, how terrible and evil all these empires were." And often these people seemed rather pale by comparison to those that had actually gone out and done it. Not a comment on good or bad, just an observation on, these imperialists had a bit more life to them. But that is the past. What about the future? Everyone right now is talking about Chat GPT. So I thought, let's get it to talk about Cyprus. Anytime I have access to a new database of information, I always, first of all, look up something I know already. Maybe it's Star Wars, maybe it's James Bond. In this occasion, British rule in Cyprus. I do have quite the collection of books. Many of them are short run, so they might only have printed a few hundred, if that, and so I do have a rather unique collection on Cypriot history books. Anyway, I thought I would test Chat GPT, and it's worth saying that it's an AI, it's a prediction machine. It kind of predicts what it thinks you're going to say based on some kind of database. It's not fact-checking, and a couple of these will be wrong. So, Chat GPT, can you give me a 100 summary of British rule in Cyprus? And it replied, the British ruled Cyprus from 1878 until the island gained independence in 1960. The British initially occupied Cyprus to provide a base for their navy and to prevent Russia from gaining access to the Mediterranean. During their rule, the British introduced a modern system of government, improved infrastructure, and promoted economic development. However, the Cypriot population was largely excluded from political power and was subjected to oppressive policies, including forced conscription and censorship. The British also established military bases on the island, which have remained a source of tension in the region. The struggle for independence intensified in the 1950s, culminating in the establishment of the Republic of Cyprus in 1960. I found this extremely interesting. For example, the Cypriot population was largely excluded from political power and subjugated to oppressive policies. That's not really true. Britain introduced representative democracy to Cyprus. It wasn't there before, certainly not under the Ottomans. Included forced conscription. Well, that's strange, because even in the Second World War, we were slow to adopt it for British citizens. I have read that I think Rhodesia introduced conscription mainly to stop people joining up because it was depopulating industries too quickly. And in Cyprus, there were a huge number of volunteers. But no, that's not true. In fact, it's true now. The modern Republic of Cyprus has conscription, but the British Empire in Cyprus did not. And censorship's an interesting one, because, of course, the UK had it, and this was mocked, of course, by some of the freer states, some of the freer African states at the height of the British Empire, I think 1936. When we had the succession crisis, there was a cartoon in, I think, a South African newspaper, which had a cartoon Englishman opening up his newspaper, and it was all kind of had holes cut in it, and he said, "By goodness, the king must be having a marvellous time." So actually in the British Empire you might be enjoying freer newspapers in the colonies and in the territories than you might back home in England. Anyway, I also found it really interesting, established military bases on the island, which have remained a source of tension for the region. Actually, they tend to guarantee security, their NATO bases, especially during the Iraq War. Anyway, I found that fascinating, so I couldn't resist asking, hey, Chat GPT, what were the positive aspects of British rule in Cyprus? Again, only 100 words. It replied, during British rule in Cyprus, there were several positive aspects that contributed to the development of the island. The British introduced modern infrastructure, including the construction of roads, railways and ports, which facilitated economic growth and improved access to markets. They also established a modern system of government, including the creation of a legislative council and the introduction of democratic practices. The British invested in education, resulting in a significant increase in literacy rates, and they supported the development of healthcare and sanitation systems. Overall, British rule in Cyprus helped to modernise the island, laying the foundation for its future development as an independent nation. All very positive. Aspects such as the sanitation system is rarely interesting. One of the best books on Cyprus from the Turkish Cypriot point of view is called The Death of Friendship, and it's about Turkan and Aziz, who was awarded an MBE. She's a Turkish nurse, and I think it was her father was involved in those sanitation efforts to eradicate malaria from the island, and that was a great public work, largely held by a single expert, a British expert who went around doing much the same in the rest of the Levant, and what is now, Palestine, Israel, and Egypt. But he also did it in Cyprus very, very, very successfully with a Turkish assistant and a Greek assistant. As I mentioned, the British introduced a legislative council and the introduction of democratic parties, weighted with the two communities. Anyway, for balance, I had to ask Chat GPT about the negative aspects of British rule in Cyprus, and it replied, during British rule in Cyprus, 1878 to 1960, there were several negative aspects that impacted the island's population. The British colonial administration imposed heavy taxes and discriminatory policies, leading to economic hardship and social unrest. The imposition of the English language and education system also marginalised the Greek Cypriot population and limited opportunities for cultural expression. The British also used military force to suppress anti-colonial movements, leading to violence and civil unrest. Additionally, the British allowed the establishment of Turkish settlements on the island, leading to democratic changes and tensions between the Greek and Turkish communities that persist to this day. Well, indeed, there are issues between the Greek and Turkish communities. But, of course, the Turks had arrived long before the Brits in the 1500s. So that is rather untrue. As for military force to suppress anti-colonial movements, again, peacekeepers were brought in largely due to Greek-on-Greek violence, although there was also, of course, Greek-on-British violence and Greek-on-Turkish violence. There was violence, indeed, in the mid-20th century, and Cyprus is not unique for that. I found it really interesting getting it to do some kind of balance, and the positive and the negative, simply because Chat GPT, not because it's any kind of reliable database, but because it predicts what people say. But maybe, now we've heard what people say, gives us some kind of an idea of where it all situates. We can look at some experts. First, a removed expert. Encyclopedia Britannica is not an expert on Cyprus, but, they employ experts on it to give a quick summary. So, a generalist view on Cyprus is, and I quote from the Encyclopedia Britannica, "The Cyprus Convention of 1878 between Britain and Turkey provided that Cyprus, while remaining under Turkish sovereignty, should be administered by the British government. Britain's aim in occupying Cyprus was to secure a base in the eastern Mediterranean for possible operations in the Caucasus or Mesopotamia as part of the British guarantee to secure the Sultan's Asian possessions from Russia. In 1914, when Britain and Turkey became adversaries during World War I, the former annexed the island. Turkey recognised this under the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. 2 years later, Cyprus was officially declared a crown colony. British occupation was initially welcomed by the Greek population, which from the start expected the British to transfer Cyprus to Greece. The Greek Cypriots' demand for aenosis, union with Greece, was opposed by Turkish Cypriots, constituting a major division in the island's politics. A string of almost annual petitions demanded aenosis were matched by counter-petitions and demonstrations from the Turkish Cypriots. Britain had made an offer to transfer the island in 1915 on condition that Greece fulfill its treaty obligations towards Serbia when that country was attacked by Bulgaria. The Greek government refused it and the offer was not renewed. In 1931, the demand for aenosis led to riots in Nicosia. Yes, that question of aenosis, whether Cyprus should be independent, as Britain largely demanded, or whether it should be clumped on to Greece 200 miles away. So that is a really good overview, but I'm always interested in, but what was life like? How was it viewed at the time? If you walked down the street, how would it feel? So for this, I'm going to make an unusual move. I'm going to do a long reading. As I say, it is unusual for me to do this, but I think it's worth it in this instance. The author of this book passed away in 1945, which means that the book now lies out of UK copyright and has been since 2015. Of course, this is different in the United States and Canada, but that is the law here. Captain C.W.J. Orr, who was also the author of The Making of Northern Nigeria, wrote a book called Cyprus, under British rule, first published in 1918. And this is the book from which I shall read. Not many years ago, a newly appointed High Commissioner of Cyprus was received by the Secretary of State for the colonies before leaving England to take up his duties. There are in Cyprus, I believe, said the Secretary of State, a number of interesting and valuable antiquities. I trust that you will see they are adequately preserved and cared for. I wish you a successful tour of office. Goodbye. It is in the hope that the interest in Cyprus taken by the general public may be somewhat less limited than that displayed by the responsible minister in this incident just recorded that I have written in this book. My self-imposed task has been to describe only the somewhat dull and unromantic details of administration, and readers who desire to learn something of the interesting and valuable antiquities, or of the scenery of this beautiful island, or the manners and customs of its inhabitants, must look elsewhere. For the information about the antiquities, the delightful pages of Cesnola's monumental work should be consulted, and some idea of the romantic charm of the island and its beautiful scenery may be gleaned from Mr. Mallock's well-known book, An Enchanted Island. A veritable mine of information is contained in Messrs. Locach and Jardine's Handbook of Cyprus, which discourses charmingly on all subjects, and from the ancient history, geological formation, and ornithology of the island to the price of eggs, hotel charges, and prevalence of fleas. In addition to such sources of information, a report is issued annually and presented to both Houses of Parliament containing much useful information regarding the finance, trade, and general progress of the island. I know of no publication, however, which gives a connected account of British administration in Cyprus or describes the conditions under which we have occupied it since 1878 and continue to hold it. As a nation, we pride ourselves on our liberal institutions and democratic form of government, but do we sufficiently realise that democracy has its responsibilities as well as its privileges? We boast of our empire on which the sun never sets, but how many of us take the trouble to acquaint ourselves with the manner in which the component parts of that empire are administered, or even where a large number of them are situated? Eminent persons who should be well informed have asked me questions about Cyprus which reveal quite plainly the fact they confuse it with Crete. Others have shown complete ignorance of the most elementary facts connected with the island. When well-informed persons display such lack of knowledge, how can one expect the mass of the community to know or care? Is it right to leave the affairs of an island with 250,000 inhabitants to the tender mercies of a government department busy with a couple of score of other communities and their problems, and to ask no questions, offer no criticisms? If this book succeeds in inducing anyone to ponder over the problems of Cyprus, or the system of Crown colony administration in general, it will have fulfilled its purpose. But if, by chance, it goes further, and arouses in anyone who reads it a feeling that England, in its treatment of Cyprus since 1878, has in any way failed in the generosity and liberality expected of a great power when dealing with its dependencies, surely there is a duty imposed upon a person to urge that we should set our house in order and make good, without any delay, any shortcoming of which we have been guilty in the past. We are fond of representing ourselves as the champions of small nationalities and peoples, and we boast of our hatred of injustice, oppression, and illiberality in any form. It behoves us, therefore, to take special care that our relations with our dependencies, our attitudes and actions should be above reproach, and that we have done nothing on our conscience which we can be justly condemned in the eyes of civilization. Chapter 1. Introduction. The island of Cyprus lies in a secluded corner of the eastern Mediterranean, stretching out a long finger towards the angle where the coast of Asia Minor, running east and west, meets the Syrian coastline running north and south. The picturesque range of hills fringing its northern shores look across at the towering heights of the Taurus mountains which skirt the Sicilian coast. And on a clear day of early spring, when a brilliant sun shines in a cloudless sky, and the snow-covered mountains stand out dazzling white against the azure background, an observer looking across the blue expanse which separates him from the opposite coast might well be deceived into imagining himself on the shore of some beautiful lake. Yet, more than 40 miles of sea separate Cyprus from the mainland. To the east, south, and west, nothing is visible but a great expanse of sea. And though it is said that on very clear days the Syrian coast, 60 miles away, can be discerned as a faint line on the eastern horizon, Egypt lies 230 miles to the south, whilst westward there is no land nearer than Crete, and the Aegean Islands nearly 200 miles away. Geographically, Cyprus belongs to the Asiatic continent. Geographically, Cyprus belongs to the Asiatic continent. Ethnographically and climatically, it may claim kinship with both Europe and Asia. The short winter lasting from December to February is not unlike the same season in Sicily and southern Europe generally. At times a fierce wind sweeps down from the north, bringing with it an icy blast from the Taurus snows, and in the island itself the mountains, which rise to a height of more than 6,000 feet, are under snow for some months, and a keen wind is carried from them to the plain below. Even during the winter months, however, though the nights are cold, the days are warmed by bright sunshine, and fires are hardly necessary except in the evenings and early mornings. By late February or early March, spring has already set in, and the island is carpeted with a wealth of wild flowers. Fields of yellow daisies, red tulips, purple irises, scarlet gladioli, white narcissus, and many-coloured amanites meet the eye everywhere, and by the end of March the landscape is green with young barley, dotted with scarlet poppies and brought into vivid relief by stretches here and there of bare, uncultivated land, or brown fields under plough, awaiting the sowing of later crops. The winter rains which fall in November and December soften the baked ground and enable the farmer to plough and sow his fields. In March and April, showers fall at intervals and refresh the young crops now well above the ground and fill out the grain. By the end of April, the fields of barley have ripened into yellow, though the wheat is still green. Soon, reaping begins under a hot sun and clear sky. The fields are full of men, women, and children, whose bright-coloured garments, red, saffron, violet, brown, pale pink, against the background of yellow corn as they reap, form a picture of singular fascination. By June, the sun's rays have gathered force, and a hot wind begins to blow like a blast from a furnace. The bare fields assume a dull, monotonous, yellow-brown appearance, and are baked and scorched by the pitiless sun. The broad, treeless plains lose any resemblance they may have had to a European scene and disclose their kinship with Asia and the East. The heat is reminiscent only of the tropics, of the plains of India and the broad expanse of the Sudan. Fortunate are the dwellers in the hill villages which nestle in well-watered valleys on the slope of the great Troodos Range, cool in their elevation of 3, 4, and even 5,000 feet above sea level. If the villagers were obliged to endure the rigour of winter snow and ice, they can now enjoy the cool mountain air and look pityingly upon their kinsfolk in the scorched plains below, amid whirling clouds of dust, or the still more dreadful calm of the burning summer day without even a breeze to stir the heavy atmosphere. Through all the heat of the early summer months, the farmers are threshing their corn on the open threshing floors outside the villages, winnowing it in the evening breeze, and when the government tithe has been measured and removed, taking the remainder on donkeys or in carts to their own houses and the merchants' stores. In autumn comes a gathering of the carob bean and the olive, and in the foothills the terraced vineyards are heavy with clustering grapes. By mid-October, The sweltering heat of the past few months in the plains have begun to abate, and the nights are cool once more. But the parched soil and the scorched vegetation await the coming of the winter rains. Soon clouds begin to bank up, only to disappear in tantalizing fashion again and again, just at the moment when they seem to be on the point of bursting and drenching the thirsty earth with their longed-for rain. But at last it comes, at first running off the baked earth in 1,000 tiny rivulets, till the crust is softened and the soil sucks up the moisture, and little blades of grass began to peep out and change the face of the bare and colourless plain. Soon the fields are dotted with the figures of peasants in their loose black breeches and coloured shirts, walking behind primitive wooden ploughs drawn by a pair of somewhat attenuated oxen, and perhaps an ox and an ass yoked together. And so throughout the winter months of December and January, amid alternations of refreshing rain and grey skies, and bright sunshine and blue skies, the work of ploughing and preparing the fields and of sowing for the next harvest goes on incessantly, until spring comes again with its wealth of fresh green and brilliant colour, and nature renews herself once more. There is nothing of the vieux monde cuisine about Cyprus village life, although the place of Cyprus in history belongs to a mystery and romantic past rather than to the bustling and prosaic present. There are no cities, no industrial centres where man has disfigured the fair face of nature with hideous factory chimneys and polluted the air with columns of black smoke. The Turkish and Greek elements of which the population is composed live apart, in towns in separate quarters, in the country in separate villages. The vast majority of people are peasant farmers, for agriculture is practically the sole industry. And they are small farmers indeed, for the average holding is but half an acre. Each village is a little entity of its own. It elects its own mukta, or headman, every 2 years, and this functionary is usually somewhat of a despot, often the richest and most powerful man in the community. Except in very small villages, each has its own school and its own church or mosque. Indeed, the first thing that strikes the traveller in the districts inhabited mainly by the Orthodox Christian element is the large and somewhat pretentious stone church in the centre of each village, rising out of the cluster of little dull-coloured sun-baked mud houses, for however poor a village may be, and some are poorer indeed, the inhabitants invariably contribute sufficient funds to build themselves a church, giving the labour themselves, fetching the stone in their own carts, sometimes from a considerable distance, and taking a pride in erecting a building which may be deemed fit for their spiritual needs. There is a charm and simplicity about the peasantry of each country, and in addition to this there is a gaiety and joie de vivre in those fortunate regions of southern Europe, where all the year round the sun shines in a clear blue sky, and the days are hot without being oppressive. Village life in Cyprus, devoted as it is entirely to agriculture, runs smoothly year by year, and probably does not differ very greatly from what it has been in previous centuries. Work in the fields throughout the year is fairly constant, but never strenuous. Harvest time is busy, but it is then, in those beautiful May days, that the sun shines most brightly in the clear sky, and the air is soft and spring-like, and the nights warm. It is good to see the brightly clad figures of the reapers in the fields, and to hear their laughter and the merry sound of their voices. When night comes, the villager will sleep beside the corn stack, piled high near the threshing floor, under a sky studded with myriads of stars. In ordinary times, the inhabitants of every village will gather towards the sunset outside the little cafes, and sit there smoking and gossiping and sipping coffee till long after night has fallen. But the great days are Sundays and Saints' days, or in the case of the Turkish villages, Fridays and festivals. Let us, for example, pay a visit in Greek Easter time to one of the villages on the northern coast that looks across to the opposite coast of Asia Minor. It lies in a sheltering valley, a little way up the range of hills, looking down on the sea, breaking lazily against a rocky coast. A stream runs sparkling beside the steep main street, and is led off by a score of tiny irrigation channels into the terraced fruit orchards and vineyards below. The sun sets, the church bells toll, and the villagers flock to the little church to attend the Good Friday service. Inside is a coffin decked with flowers, and the church is packed with peasants bearing in their hands tall yellow candles from which they obtained from a tray at their entrance and light from their neighbours. One by one they approach the coffin and, reverently kneeling before it, bend and kiss it, and then move on and mingle again with the crowd. The priest drones in a monotonous sing-song voice, pausing every now and then for responses. The crowd wears an act of reverence and solemnity, and towards midnight begin to melt away, the people returning in silence to their homes. On Sunday morning, the village is astir early, everyone dressed in their best. A blue and white flag floats from the church, and most of the houses and shops are decorated with flags and banners. The cake and sweet sellers' stalls are piled high with delicacies of every kind, and the cafe keepers have set out all available tables and chairs in front of their cafes, and have made ready an ample supply of coffee and wine. After church, the day is given over to merriment and rejoicing. There are processions, dancing, feasting, speech-making and music. Men, women and children flock in from the outer-lying villages and join the festivities. Large quantities of the rough wine of the island are consumed, and by nightfall perhaps some quarrelling or brawling takes place outside the cafes, but for the most part the crowd is merry and good-humoured and intent on enjoying their Easter holiday. In the Turkish villages, very similar scenes may be observed at Bayram, after the long fast of Ramadan, or on one of the other Mohammedan festival days. Here is a Turkish village which lies in a picturesque valley amongst the lower slopes of the mountain range, which rises from the central plains and culminates in the great peak of Mount Olympus. It looks down on to the flat, treeless plain below, green with young barley in the spring, with here and there patches of red-brown earth where a field has been ploughed for a late crop, and across this to the graceful contour of the northern range, clear-cut against the sky. To the left is a wide, sweeping bay, in which a narrow rim of yellow beach lies sharply defined against the background of the dark blue sea, on which the white sails of a few fishing boats stand out clearly, the whole picture lit by the brilliant sun of a clear spring morning. The village itself is a maze of orange groves, for it is famous for its oranges and fruit growing of its staple industry. The sound of running water is to be heard everywhere, and the hum of insects among the orange trees. Little narrow lanes, bordered by the high walls of sun-baked brick, which enclose the orange plantations, wander tortuously up the hillside on which the village lies, and lead to the open space where the bazaars are situated and the shopkeepers display their wares. On a slight eminence, rising from the tangle of houses, stands the mosque with its graceful minaret overlooking the town. The day being a Mohammedan festival, the streets are full of holiday-makers who have donned their gayest costumes, many of them wearing flowers pinned to their fezzes. In a red-tiled, two-storied house of lath and plaster, a venerable old Turkish gentleman, in black frock coat, dark trousers, elastic-sided boots and red fez, is entertaining visitors who have called, in accordance with the custom, to pay their respects on this day of festival. Coffee and cigarettes are brought in on a tray by a youth, clad in loose, baggy white breeches, pale blue stockings with red, ornamental red designs, shirt of pale primrose, and a richly embroidered waistcoat. On another tray are sweets, and apricots in syrup, for the Turk has a sweet tooth, which are handed round to the guests, for each of whom a long silver fork is provided, with which he helps himself to the fruit. The host sits on a divan, smoking a cigarette and discussing with his guests all the local news. The prospect of next season's fruit crop, the profit to be made from the one recently placed on the market, the weather, neighbours' affairs, and all such matters of local interest. In the narrow lanes, the figure of a Turkish lady is seen occasionally, clad in a loose gown of dark plum colour or black, her face completely hidden by the yashmak, and only a pair of beady black eyes showing. As night falls, the shops in the bazaars are lit up, the musicians play merry jigs outside the cafes, little coloured lanterns are hung in gay festoons from the minaret to the roof of the mosque. Here and there a group of people may be seen sitting round a venerable old Turk, who is telling one of those wonderful tales in which all the Orientals delight. The story is followed with breathless interest, its witticism greeted with shouts of laughter and rounds of applause. Such are typical scenes of Cyprus village life. Life in the 3 or 4 coastal towns differ little from it, in spite of the comparative sophistication in which electric light and cinema shows are the outward and visible signs. There is, of course, more luxury and less simplicity than in the villages, more graduation of the social scale, more display and extravagance on the one hand, more squalor and poverty on the other. The event of the week is the arrival of the weekly mail steamer from Egypt. The pier is crowded with baskets of fruit, sacks of potatoes, casks of wine and other local produce awaiting shipment to Egypt, whilst close to the beach is a penfold of attenuated sheep destined for the Alexandria market and possibly a few oxen and swine. There is much bustle and stir when the steamer is signalled, and the shipping agents hurry to the pier, and everywhere there is eager curiosity to hear what news the mail will bring. In a short time, the steamer is hard at work, discharging cargo and taking in the live stock, and the produce ready for shipment, and the work often continues far into the night. But at last it is completed, and the smoke of the departing steamer is seen on the horizon. The town settles down once more to its normal life, and awaits the return of the steamer the following week, when the same scenes will be enacted in the same manner, only with trifling variations according to the season of the year. Village life in Cyprus in the 20th century differs little, in all probability, from what it has been for the last 3,000 years. The sun-baked mud houses, the paved threshing floors, the primitive agricultural implements, all recall the shadowy past, the days of the earliest civilization. The wooden plough, with its pointed metal shaft, is of the same pattern as those which are seen portrayed on the walls of the ancient Egyptian temples, and similar ones must have been in use for 1,000 years. Many of the customs and superstitions of the Cypriot peasant are palpable legacies from the remote past when their ancestors worshipped at the temples of Isis or Aphrodite. It is a curious reflection that when the descendants of the rude savages who inhabited Britain, when Cyprus stood at the forefront of civilization, should, after the lapse of so many centuries, have come from across the seas to aid Cyprus to rise from its long sleep and regain some, at least, of its former prosperity. Well, that was Chapter 1 of Cyprus under British Rule by Sir Charles William James Orr, a colonial administrator. I love the way he writes, and I think what he writes about Cyprus is so interesting. He wrote this book in 1918, and very, very little of this had changed by the time I went there, at least in terms of the rhythm of life in the island and life in the villages. I really enjoy it, so I may return for a part 2.